Father locked the chest and went downstairs. Pierre, behind the door, listened for a moment longer before going back to bed. Something touched his arm. Pierre whirled around. His 7-year-old brother Henri stood by him, rubbing his eyes. A blanket trailed behind him. "Is it time to get up?" "No, Henri." Pierre tucked his brother in bed and lay down himself. The voices downstairs drifted farther and farther away. The next he knew, Othalie was shouting, "Hurry and get dressed! Your father wants to see you and Henri before he goes to the port." "Boys," Father said when Pierre and Henri came into the kitchen, "something happened yesterday. It's too long to explain, but I want you both to stay inside the garden. If any strangers ring, run into the house. You see, there may be some people who would like to take you away from us, especially Henri." "Where would they take me?" Henri asked. "To a convent school," Father said. "Pierre, you must always look out for Henri." Pierre nodded. After Father left, the boys went to their mud fort in the garden. Pierre gave Henri some twigs. "There's your army," he said. "First the pikemen, then musketeers and cavalrymen, and last the dragoons." The boys set up 2 armies. "The musketeers come ahead and fire, and then go behind the pikemen to reload," Pierre said, moving some of his stick soldiers. "And we have to have 2 rows of cavalrymen. 1 row fires, and then they reload while the other row fires. The dragoons are last. They can fight on horseback or on foot." Horses' hooves clattered on the cobbled street outside. Henri looked up, wide-eyed with fright. Pierre tried to hide his own sudden fear. He soothed his little brother in a whisper. "Maybe they won't stop here. The words died on his lips. The horses had stopped at the gate. Henri's eyes brimmed with tears as he looked up at Pierre. "Don't let them take me away. I don't want to go to a convent school." He started to run toward the house, but Pierre caught him by the arm. "It's too late to hide in there. We're safer out here if they break the gate down." He looked around for a hiding place. It was no use to hide behind the scraggly bushes. An early cold spell had stripped them of their leaves. Pierre pulled Henri behind the fort. The bell at the gate clanged once, twice. There was a pause, and then 3 quick peals blended together. With a shout of joy, Pierre jumped up. "Come on, Henri! There's nothing to be afraid of. That's Grand-Pierre's own special ring." The boys ran to open the gate. Pierre's delight turned to amazement. Instead of Grand-Pierre's carriage, white horses, and a men in livery bowing and opening the carriage door, the only people outside were a white-haired old man and a boy on 2 saddle horses. The man took off a large feathered hat and handed it to the boy as they dismounted. The boy, a peasant about Pierre's age, helped the old man fasten the buttons of his dark, knee-length cape, and then drew out a clean handkerchief from the big patch pocket for the old man to wipe his face. "Grand-Pierre!" Both boys flung themselves on their grandfather. "What happened? Where's your carriage? You've never come home on horse before. We didn't know you at first." In spite of a look of pain and worry, Grand-Pierre smiled and hugged the boys. "Where's your mother?" "Inside. She and Othalie are weaving a rug." Grand-Pierre motioned the peasant boy to follow him into the house. At the door, the boy took off his wooden sabots and carried them under his arm. Mother and Othalie sat on the sunshiny front room, braiding bits of dark blue velvet and pale pink cloth, just as they always did in the morning after the work was done. At the sight of Grand-Pierre, Mother flushed with pleasure and stood up so suddenly that the strips of cloth fell to the floor. With a little cry, Othalie knelt and began to pick them up. Mother ran to Grand-Pierre, both hands extended in welcome. "Father, this is a surprise!" Grand-Pierre's mouth twisted into an odd expression. "You've heard?" Mother gazed up at him as if trying to read his face. Grand-Pierre did not answer right away. He caught her hand in his and bent to kiss them. Mother called to Othalie. Never mind picking up now, Othley. Bring a chair for father. Othley drew up a chair near the fireplace. Shall I light the fire, madame? No, it's too warm for that. Sit down, father. Do I know this young boy? She smiled at the peasant boy who stood rubbing his hand on his full skirt-like breeches. This is Claude Arnaud, Grandpierre said. His parents died last winter. Scarlet fever. Claude is a great help to me. He put his arm around the boy. I didn't want to bring any of the men because they may have to defend the estate. Grandpierre stopped, as if he had said too much. But don't worry, Matilda. We haven't seen any soldiers yet. Mother picked up a braid of cloth and bent over her work. Has it come to that so soon, father? Yes. Pierre could take a message to Paul if you think it's advisable. It's only a 20-minute walk to the port. Grandpierre stared at a patch of sunlight on the floor. It would be advisable. We must plan what to do. Very well. Pierre, go tell your father that Grandpierre is here on horseback. Be sure to say it just like that. May I go? Henri asked, running to his mother. No! Grandpierre exploded. Henri's lips quivered. Henri, don't you remember what father said this morning? Mother asked. Oh, Henri said, somebody might take me. Grandpierre looked surprised. We can't take chances, father. Paul warned them this morning. Grandpierre nodded. You're a good boy, Henri, he said, and you too, Pierre. Run and tell your father to come home as soon as he can. Take Claude with you, he added. He's never been in town before. Pierre ran to get his wide-brimmed beaver hat. Claude stared at it, and at Pierre's fine leather shoes. Would you like to come with me, Claude? Claude nodded and bowed to Mother and Grandpierre. Once outside, Claude put on his wooden sabots. Claude, why did Grandpierre come this way? What's going to happen? Do you know? Pierre asked as they walked along the seawall. Claude shook his head. All I know is that an old beggar came to the gates and whispered to the guard. The guard took him to your grandfather, and they talked together, like good friends. It was very odd. Why would a fine gentleman like your grandfather be interested in a raggedy old beggar? At first, Pierre could think of no reason at all. Then he had an inspiration. A messenger in disguise, perhaps? But he looked as if he didn't have any sense, Claude said. Anyway, I didn't see the beggar again. He pointed to the crowded wharf. What's going on there? What's everybody doing? Pierre laughed. It's always like that when a ship comes in. They're unloading one of Father's ships. 2 lines of men trotted up and down the gangplank. Those coming off the ship bent almost double from the loads on their backs. Some put their bundles on the growing piles on the dock. Others disappeared through doorways of the 3- and 4-story buildings nearby. Casks and bales of goods lined the wharf. Merchants examined one after another. Bankers sat behind little booths, exchanging money or rendering accounts. A few women in shawls and tiny bonnets picked their way across the slippery cobblestones. Claude lingered, staring at the scene. Hurry, Claude, we must find father. Pierre almost had to pull the peasant boy through a narrow doorway. At a small desk, on a low-ceilinged room, a clerk was furiously checking off items on a long list. Yes, what is it? He asked, looking up. Is my father here? Pierre asked. Oh, excuse me, yes, he's in the cellar. Go on down. The boys went down a narrow stairway. Who's there? His father sounded alarmed. It's Pierre. Oh. Father appeared around a bend of the tunnel-like cellar and brushed his hands. Pierre stared at them. Father looked as if he had been digging. What is it, son? Grandpierre is here on horseback. Father spoke politely, but he seemed nervous. I'll come home as soon as I can. Go straight home, both of you. It isn't good to be out on the streets like this in these times. Outside, Pierre considered Father's words. Of course he would obey, but he could see nothing dangerous so far. It would not be much further to go home by way of the town square, and Claude could see the shops. This way, he said. leading Claude toward a narrow, cobbled street, flanked on both sides by jutting apartments. Claude craned his neck. Do people live up there? Pierre glimpsed a movement at an open window. He pulled Claude back against the wall, just as a housewife flung the contents of a slop pail into the street. Pierre cupped his hand over his mouth and shouted up to her, "Please be careful, madame! You almost wet us through!" A trill of laughter answered him. "Then stay off the streets, you young Huguenots! You have no right to walk them now!" Pierre stopped in astonishment, his mouth open. Was the woman out of her mind? He had never heard such talk from the townspeople before. He stared upward. A young woman stood at the lattice window, tucking a strand of hair under her close-fitting cap. Pierre knew her by sight. He had seen her at the port other times when she waited for her husband. As soon as she saw the boys looking up at her, the young woman began to finger a large cross hanging around her neck and over her wide shawl-like collar. "How do you know we're Huguenots?" Pierre asked. "Oh, don't look so blank, you innocents. Look about you. Do you see anyone else on the street?" It was true. No one else was in sight. Shop doors were latched tight. Along the street, other windows opened one by one. Neighbor women leaned their elbows on the windowsills and listened. "Do you hear the chanting?" the young woman asked. "They'll be here soon." She stamped her foot. "Be off with you both! How dare you desecrate this ground?" In a daze, Pierre tugged at Claude's sleeve. The boys hurried on. A coldness enveloped Pierre, a coldness that had nothing to do with the shadowed, twisting street. He felt frightened and humiliated. Something had changed since the church bells had rung yesterday. It was as if this woman and others watching in silence were waiting for something bad to happen. A splatter of water nearby made both boys jump. One of the neighbor women had emptied her slop jar on the street. Pierre began to run with Claude right behind him. One by one, the women opened their windows and threw water at the boys. Pierre turned toward the town square. The mocking voices of the housewives followed them. When the boys reached the sunlit square, Pierre fanned himself a moment with his hat. Claude showed no sign of fatigue. "Is this the way they treat you all the time?" he asked. "No, it was never like this before yesterday." Pierre told about the church bells, but did not mention the midnight meeting. Claude took off his wet jacket and let it dry in the sun. "I don't think I'd like to live in town," he said. Pierre laughed in a rueful tone. "I didn't know it would be like this, or I wouldn't have brought you this way." He realized he should have obeyed his father. The boys started across the square just as a church procession emerged from a side street. Men in long gowns with embroidered soles and cornered hats swayed in time to their chanting. They looked neither to the right nor to the left as they held aloft images and relics on satin pillows. "Quick, in here, Claude." Pierre motioned to a doorway. "Don't move. Let's hope they don't see us." But someone had seen them. A man in church robes strode up and seized Pierre by the scruff of the neck. "What do you mean insulting God? Take off your hat, boy!" Fear tightened Pierre's throat, but he managed to gasp out two words. "I cannot." "Take your hat off in the presence of God, I say!" The man's grip tightened. He shook Pierre, jerking him off his feet. "But God isn't on that pillow!" Pierre was gasping for breath now. "Why, you young heretic, you!" Claude gave a mighty push and shoved the priest off balance. "Run, Pierre!" They bolted toward the other end of the square. Claude ran easily. Spurred by fear, Pierre kept up with him. The boys did not stop until they reached the garden gate. Ottilie, the maid, opened it at once when Pierre rang. "What took you so long? I was waiting for you." She led the way to the house. "What shall we tell the boys?" Mother asked as Pierre and Claude came into the room. She looked as if she had been crying. "We'll wait until Father comes." Even after Father came, there was no mention of what had happened. It was only after supper, when the family sat around the fire, that Pierre ventured to ask. Grandpierre settled back in his chair. A long time ago, a good king of France promised the Huguenots freedom of worship. We could hold public office and be educated just like anyone else in France. Before that, the Huguenots suffered a great deal because of their beliefs. Their homes were burned, their places of worship worn down. Many lost their lives. But the good king put a stop to that. He was in the town of Nantes at the time, and his written promise was called the Edict of Nantes. About 5 years ago, certain people persuaded the present king to be stricter with the Huguenots. They said we were heretics, that we did not love God. The king listened to these people, and now he has broken the promise made so very long ago. The Edict of Nantes has been revoked. Pierre guessed at the meaning of the word revoked, but he was glad when Claude asked, "What does revoked mean?" It means the law has been called back. After 87 years of being enforced, it does not exist anymore, as of October 18, 1685. The king will do everything to make us give up our religion. As he spoke, there was a sound of voices outside the garden wall. A stone shattered the window above the window seat and bounced to the floor. A splinter of glass struck Henri on the forehead, and he turned an inquiring gaze to his mother. A trickle of blood flowed from the cut on his head. The little group sat in stunned silence as angry voices filled the air. "The Huguenots are heretics! Kill them! They mock God! Kill them all!"